The Varick Empire had catalogued 412 worlds. Of those, 61 had possessed what the imperial cartographers classified as Class 3 civilizations, species advanced enough to build cities, establish governments, and develop rudimentary energy weapons. Species that, upon first contact with an Empire warfleet, would inevitably move through the 5 recognized stages: observation, confusion, communication, negotiation, and finally, submission. It had never taken longer than 9 days. Commodore Sharnveth of the 3rd Conquest Division had personally overseen the pacification of 11 worlds. He was not a cruel commander by Varick standards. He did not enjoy the burning of cities or the silencing of populations. What he enjoyed, what gave him a deep, almost philosophical satisfaction, was the moment a civilization understood the arithmetic of the situation. The moment their leaders looked at his fleet, looked at their own defenses, and accepted the only logical conclusion available to them. That moment, in his experience, always came. He stood at the forward observation deck of the Eternal Dominion and studied the blue-white planet rotating slowly on the display before him. His senior surveyor, a precise and humorless officer named Kethra, stood at his shoulder with a data scroll already prepared. Designation? Sharnveth asked. The inhabitants call it Earth, Kethra said. 3rd orbital position from their star. Single large moon. 71% surface water. Atmospheric composition breathable, within tolerance. Population. Approximately 8 billion. Concentrated in surface settlements of varying size. Largest single settlement, they call it Tokyo, houses approximately 37 million. Sharnveth clasped his hands behind his back. 8 billion was substantial. The largest population he had pacified before was the Drenathai of the Cygnus Belt, who had numbered nearly 12 billion across 3 interconnected worlds. That campaign had taken 6 days and cost him for shuttle crews due to a navigational error in the upper atmosphere of their second planet. He still considered it his least efficient operation. Military capability. Kethra scrolled. Fragmented. Divided into approximately 195 separate political entities, each maintaining independent armed forces. No unified planetary command structure. Their most advanced weapons are chemically propelled projectiles and early-generation fusion warheads. She paused, checking the data a second time, which they have, remarkably, pointed at each other for the majority of their recorded history. Sharnveth allowed himself a small sound of amusement. They've been at war with themselves. Continuously, Commodore. For as long as their records exist. He turned away from the display and walked to the wide viewport at the far end of the deck, looking at the actual planet rather than its representation. It hung there in the dark with an almost absurd beauty, blue and white and faintly luminous, wrapped in slow spirals of cloud. He had seen hundreds of inhabited worlds. Most of them were brown or grey or the dull amber of oxidized minerals. This one looked almost deliberately appealing, as if it had been designed by something with an eye for aesthetics. They've been fighting themselves, he said quietly, more to himself than to Kethra. No unified defense. Primitive weapons. 8 billion individuals who have never once had to consider the possibility of a threat from beyond their own sky. That is correct. Prepare the standard contact package. Broadcast on all frequencies they use. I want translation matrices running before we enter their detection range. We'll give them 12 hours to identify our fleet, convene whatever leadership structure they possess, and formulate a response. And if they attempt to engage... Sharnveth turned from the window. They won't. They'll scan us, count our ships, and start making calls to each other in a panic. He moved back toward the command platform. Schedule the formal demand transmission for Hour 14. I want to be in high orbit before nightfall on their primary landmass. Kethra made the notation. Do you want a threat demonstration prepared? Orbital strike on an uninhabited region, standard intimidation protocol. He considered it briefly. No. Not yet. Let's see how they respond to the simple reality of our presence first. Sometimes the fleet is enough. It was, in his experience, almost always enough. They detected the fleet at precisely the moment Shanveth had expected, when the Eternal Dominion and its 17 accompanying warships crossed what the humans called the lunar threshold, passing close enough to their single moon that every ground-based telescope and orbital sensor array on the planet would have registered the contact simultaneously. He watched the communications data spike on Kethare's panel. Radio signals erupting outward from every major population center, bouncing between satellites, cascading through what the translation matrices identified as global information networks. "They're talking," Kethra observed. "Of course they are." Shanveth settled into the command chair. "What are they saying?" She listened through her translation earpiece for a long moment. Her expression, normally as readable as carved stone, shifted almost imperceptibly. "Many things," she said. "There is significant variation in tone. Some transmissions appear to be civilian broadcasts, news reporting, public information. Others are encrypted government and military channels." She paused. "There is also a substantial portion of their network dedicated to what I can only describe as individual citizens communicating their personal reactions." "Which are?" She listened again. "Fear, predominantly. Also curiosity. Some hostility." Another pause, longer this time. "And what the translator is classifying as dark humor. They are making jokes, Commodore." Shanveth looked up from his display. "Jokes." Approximately 17% of the sampled public transmissions contain what the Matrix identifies as attempts at comedic expression. References to their own cultural narratives about first contact, entertainment fictions, it appears. One phrase is recurring frequently enough that I flagged it. She read carefully from her panel. "We come in peace." It seems to be a line from one of their historical entertainment programs. They are repeating it ironically. He stared at her for a moment. Then he returned his gaze to the forward display and said nothing. In 11 campaigns across 400 years of Imperial service, no population had ever responded to the initial appearance of a Varric warfleet with irony. At hour 12, the response came, not from a single unified government, as he had hoped, but from something more complicated. A hastily assembled collective of what the translation matrices identified as heads of state, military commanders, scientists, and representatives of something called the United Nations. Their transmission was rough at the edges, clearly assembled under pressure, multiple languages overlaid with real-time translation, the faces of the speakers showing the particular kind of controlled fear that Shanveth had learned to recognize across dozens of species. That tightness around the eyes. The deliberate steadiness of the voice when the hands were almost certainly shaking. The lead speaker was a small, older female with silver-streaked hair who identified herself as the Secretary General of their planetary collective body. Her name, rendered through the translation matrix, was something that came out approximately as Anna Reyes. She said, "We have observed your fleet. We understand you represent a civilization with capabilities that exceed our own. We are prepared to discuss terms of contact on the condition that no hostile action is taken against civilian populations." A pause. "We would also ask, for clarity, what do you want?" Shanveth found himself oddly moved by the question. Not by its content, it was entirely standard, the kind of opening that every species eventually asked, but by the particular quality of its delivery. She was afraid. That was obvious. But she was asking anyway, and asking clearly, without theater or bluster or the kind of performative defiance that some species attempted in these first moments to mask their terror. He composed his response carefully and transmitted it himself rather than delegating to a communications officer. "We are the Varric Empire," he said. "We have come to add your world to our dominion. You will be given the opportunity to negotiate the terms of your integration, which will determine the conditions under which your population continues to exist and the degree of autonomy your regional governments may retain. You have 24 of your hours to deliver a formal response. We recommend surrender." He closed the channel. Kethra was quiet for a moment. Then, 24 hours is more generous than standard protocol, Commodore. "I know. You usually allow 12. "I know." He looked at the planet again. "Something about them is making me cautious." I can't identify what it is yet. He folded his hands. Let them have their day. Let them argue with each other and look at the data and arrive at the only conclusion the data supports. Then we'll proceed. The 24 hours passed. At the 23rd hour, with 1 hour remaining before his deadline, Sharnveth received a second transmission from the human collective body. Anna Reyes appeared on his display again. The same controlled composure. The same careful eyes. She said, "We have discussed your offer at length. We have reviewed your fleet's capabilities against our own. We understand the arithmetic, as you likely expect us to." A brief pause. "We are not going to surrender." Sharnveth went very still. "We would like to propose an alternative arrangement," Reyes continued. "One that we believe may be of greater long-term value to your empire than the pacification of a single planet. We are prepared to discuss this at a neutral location of your choosing. We ask only that you delay any hostile action for 7 of our days while these discussions take place." Another pause, shorter this time. "We think, when you understand us better, you may find that we are more useful to you intact than in pieces." The transmission ended. For a long moment, the command deck of the Eternal Dominion was completely silent. Then Kethra said, very quietly, "They refused." "Yes. No species has ever refused the initial demand, Commodore." Sharnveth did not answer immediately. He was looking at the planet, at the slow rotation of those blue oceans, those white clouds, that implausible and distracting beauty, and he was thinking about a small, silver-haired woman delivering a refusal with steady hands and asking for 7 days. "Begin orbital approach," he said at last. "And get me everything in our database on how these people fight. Not their weapons. Not their technology." He paused. "How they think. How they've survived fighting each other this long without destroying themselves entirely." Kethra looked up from her panel. It was the first time in 6 years of service that he had seen genuine uncertainty in her face. "You think they know something we don't," she said. Sharnveth didn't answer. He watched Earth turn in the dark, patient and blue and utterly unimpressed by the 18 warships hanging above it, and he felt, for the first time in 400 years of conquest, the faint, unfamiliar shape of something he had almost forgotten. Not quite fear, but its distant cousin. The database on human conflict was, by any measure, the most disturbing document Sharnveth had ever read. Not because of the scale of their wars, the Varric Empire had orchestrated campaigns that made human conflicts look like border skirmishes. Not because of their weapons, which were primitive by any interstellar standard. What disturbed him, as he moved through the compiled records in the quiet of his private quarters while the fleet held position above Earth's terminator line, was the pattern. Every other species the Empire had encountered followed a recognizable arc of warfare. Wars began over resources or territory, escalated to a point of mutual exhaustion, and ended in negotiated settlement or the absolute destruction of one party. It was logical. It was, in its way, efficient. Even the most aggressive species the Empire had pacified had an internal governor, some biological or cultural mechanism that, when losses reached a sufficient threshold, triggered the surrender response. Humans, as far as Sharnveth could determine, did not have that mechanism. Or if they did, it was calibrated so differently from every other known species that it might as well not exist. He read about a conflict they called the Second World War. A war that consumed nearly every populated landmass on their planet simultaneously, killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million of their own people, and ended only when 2 cities were effectively erased from existence by weapons the humans themselves had invented specifically for that purpose. He read about what followed, not peace, exactly, but a kind of armed stillness in which the 2 dominant powers of the post-war period pointed extinction-level weapons at each other for approximately 50 years and somehow, through a combination of strategic calculation and what the historical records described with uncomfortable frequency as pure luck, did not use them. He read about soldiers in a conflict called Vietnam who continued fighting for years after any rational assessment of the strategic situation would have indicated the cause was lost. He read about a Finnish defensive campaign against a vastly larger invading force, the historical records called it the Winter War, in which an outnumbered, outgunned population held their ground in temperatures that should have made sustained combat impossible, inflicting casualties so disproportionate that the invading commanders reportedly refused to publicly disclose the true numbers for decades afterward. He read about Stalingrad. He spent a long time on Stalingrad. When Kethra knocked on his quarters door at the 4th hour of ship's night, he was still reading. She entered to find him not at his desk but sitting on the floor against the far wall, the data scroll in his hands, with an expression she had never seen on him in 6 years. "Commodore, come look at this," he said, which was also something he had never said to her before. She crossed the room and looked at the display he held out to her. It showed casualty figures from a conflict the humans called the Eastern Front, a subset of the larger war he had been reading about, spanning approximately 4 years of continuous engagement across a land mass of several million square kilometers. She read the numbers. Then she read them again. "These figures are incorrect," she said. "I had the database cross-reference 3 independent human historical sources," Sharnveth said. "They're consistent within acceptable margins of variation." Kethra was quiet for a moment. "This single theater of this single war killed more individuals than the entire population of the largest planet we have ever pacified." "Yes." "And neither side stopped." "Neither side stopped." Sharnveth set the scroll down on the floor beside him. "They kept fighting. Both of them. For 4 years, absorbing losses that should have, triggered complete social and military collapse in any species we have ever encountered. And when it was over, the side that had suffered the greater losses celebrated." He paused. "They held parades, Kethra, in the rubble of cities that had been burning for 3 years. They stood in the ruins and they celebrated." She said nothing. "I've been trying to identify the evolutionary origin of this," he said. "Some pressure in their developmental history that would select for this kind of," he searched for the word, "this refusal. Whatever it is. I can't find a clean answer. The best analysis I can construct is that their environment, for most of their evolutionary history, was simply hostile enough and unpredictable enough that the individuals who survived long enough to reproduce were, disproportionately, the ones who did not stop when stopping would have been rational." He picked up the scroll again. "We may have spent 400 years cataloging civilizations without ever encountering one that evolved specifically to endure. Kethra sat down, also unprecedented, in his private quarters, uninvited, and looked at the display over his shoulder. The response they sent. "The Secretary General." She said they understood the arithmetic. Yes. She wasn't bluffing. She knew exactly how outmatched they are. She knew exactly how outmatched they are, Sharnveth confirmed, and she refused anyway. "And the part that concerns me most," he turned the scroll off and looked at the far wall, "is that based on everything I've just read, that is not an aberration. That is not one unusual leader making an unusual decision under pressure. That is what they do. Consistently. Across their entire recorded history. Against each other, against every environmental catastrophe their planet has thrown at them, against every conceivable calculation that should have produced surrender. He was quiet for a moment. They have a phrase for it. The translation matrix renders it as, not yet. They use it the way other species use the word enough. Kethra was silent for a long time. Outside the small viewport in Shanvetha's quarters, Earth turned in the dark. From this distance, in the blue-black of the Terminator, the lights of their cities were visible, scattered constellations across the night side, dense and irregular and alive. "What do you want to do?" she asked. It was the kind of question a subordinate officer should not ask a commodore. Shanveth did not correct her for it. "I want to take the meeting," he said. He sent the response personally, again, as he had sent the initial demand. He agreed to the 7-day suspension of hostilities. He proposed a meeting location, a neutral orbital platform, which his engineering crew could construct and position within 48 hours, in a high equatorial orbit above the landmass the humans called the Pacific Ocean. He invited a delegation of no more than 6. He would bring no more than 6 himself. The human response came within 3 hours. Accepted. The platform went up in 31 hours, which was 11 hours faster than his engineering officer had quoted him. Shanveth made a note of that and said nothing. The human delegation arrived in a vehicle that was, by any objective measure, barely spaceworthy. A reproposed orbital shuttle. He could see the modification work on the hull from the docking camera, the added fuel capacity, the jury-rigged atmosphere controls that had clearly been assembled from existing components under significant time pressure. It docked with the platform with a competence that surprised him, given the equipment. They came in 6, as agreed. Ana Reyes was first through the airlock, wearing what the cultural database identified as formal diplomatic attire, dark, structured, minimal. Behind her, 2 military officers in dress uniforms, a scientist whose credentials identified him as a physicist, a woman introduced as a linguist and cultural liaison, and a man in civilian clothes whose role was not immediately apparent. He was young, Shanveth noted, by human standards. Younger than the others by a considerable margin. Reyes looked at Shanveth for a moment across the meeting chamber, a plain room, 2 tables, chairs scaled roughly to human dimensions by his crew's best estimate, and then she did something he had not expected. She looked around the room carefully, taking in the construction, the materials, the joins in the wall panels. Then she looked back at him. "You built this in less than 2 days, she said. 31 hours, he confirmed. She nodded slowly, and he understood that she was doing what he had been doing, gathering data. Calibrating. Filing away the information that his engineering crew could construct a habitable orbital structure in 31 hours, without visible effort, as a matter of routine. Good, he thought. She should know that. They Saturday. His translator provided real-time rendering in both directions, a technology the human linguist examined with undisguised professional fascination during the preliminary formalities. "I'll be direct," Reyes said, when the formalities concluded. "You have the capability to destroy our surface infrastructure within hours. We have run the models. We know what your weapons can do. We are not under any illusion about the military situation." She folded her hands on the table. "But you have not fired yet. You have been in high orbit for 4 days. That tells us something." "What does it tell you?" Shanveth asked. "That you're not certain the military solution is the optimal one." She met his eyes, her species made sustained direct eye contact, he had noted, in a way that most species did not, and it produced an involuntary attentiveness in him that he found slightly annoying. "We'd like to tell you why you're right to be uncertain." One of the military officers, a broad-shouldered man with a chest full of decorations that Shanvetha's cultural database could not fully decode, leaned forward slightly. "You've been studying us," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Shanveth said. "Our wars. Among other things." The military officer looked at Reyes. Something passed between them, the particular silent communication of people who had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation. Reyes said, "Then you understand that a ground campaign against this planet would not go the way your previous campaigns have gone." "Explain." She opened the case she had brought and placed a single data drive on the table, a human device, he noted, not an attempt to interface with Varric technology. "We have prepared an analysis," she said. "It covers terrain, climate variation, population distribution, cultural and regional variance in defensive postures, and historical precedent for insurgent resistance across our documented military history." She paused. "The summary version is this: you can burn our cities. You can destroy our infrastructure. You can remove our governments. And then you will have 8 billion humans with nothing left to lose, distributed across a planet with 20 distinct major climate zones and approximately 195 distinct regional cultures, many of which have been preparing for exactly this kind of existential scenario in their cultural imagination for the better part of a century." The young man in civilian clothes, the one whose role Shanveth hadn't identified, spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, almost academic. "We write stories about this," he said. "Thousands of them. Aliens invade, we lose everything, we fight anyway. We've been rehearsing this, culturally, for generations. We find it," a brief pause, "motivating." Shanveth looked at him. "Who are you?" "A historian," the young man said. "She brought me to explain the part the data doesn't capture." "And what part is that?" The young man looked at him with the particular directness his species seemed to default to in high-pressure situations. "The part where we don't stop." The room was quiet. Outside the viewport, Earth hung in the black, enormous and patient, wrapped in its slow weather, the lights of its night side burning steadily below. Shanveth looked at the data drive on the table. Then at Reyes. Then, for a long moment, at the planet behind her. "Show me the analysis," he said. The analysis took 4 hours to present. Shanveth sat through all of it without interruption. His officers, Kethra and a tactical analyst named Vorseth who had joined him for the meeting, were less disciplined. Vorseth interrupted twice in the first hour, citing what he called fundamental miscalculations in the human resistance projections. The physicist on the human side answered both objections with a precision that silenced Vorseth so completely that he did not speak again for the remainder of the session. The data itself was not what changed Shanveth's thinking. The data was, in many respects, exactly what he had already constructed from his own research. Casualty projections for a surface campaign. Logistical modeling for occupation forces across 20 climate zones. Timeline estimates for pacification under various levels of resistance, optimistic, realistic, worst case. The worst case column extended to figures that his tactical analyst would later describe, in his private log, as implausible. They were not implausible. That was the problem. They were, if anything, conservative. What changed Shanvetha's thinking was a single image the historian brought up near the end of the 4th hour. Not a chart. Not a projection model. A photograph, a human capture of visible light, two-dimensional, taken approximately 80 years prior by their own reckoning. It showed a street in one of their cities, deep in the rubble of what had clearly been sustained bombardment. The buildings on either side were skeletal. The road surface was cratered and strewn with debris. And in the middle of the street, in front of what had once been a storefront, someone had placed a small wooden table. On the table was a vase of flowers. Shanveth looked at the image for a long time. "What city?" he asked. "London," Reyes said. "During a period we call the Blitz. Their city was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Every morning, people came out of underground shelters and went to work." She paused. "Some of them brought flowers." Shanveth looked at the image a moment longer. Then he looked at the historian. "Why flowers?" The young man considered the question seriously, which Shanveth appreciated. "Because it was an act of will," he said finally. "The flowers meant, you have not taken this from us. Whatever this is. The thing that puts flowers on a table in a bombed street. You have not reached it. You cannot reach it." He paused. "That is, functionally, what all of our history is. 8 billion people who come from a very long line of people who put flowers on the table." The room was quiet for a long time after that. Then Shanveth said, "Leave the drive. I'd like my tactical staff to review the full models." He stood, and the human stood with him. "We'll reconvene in 48 hours. He did not sleep during those 48 hours. Neither, as far as he could tell from the sensor readings on the human shuttle still docked at the platform, did the human delegation. Vorseth presented his formal tactical assessment at hour 36. It was, Shanveth noted, significantly different in tone from anything the man had produced in 11 previous campaigns. The language was careful in a way that Vorsetha's language was never careful. The projections were hedged. The worst-case column had been expanded to include scenarios that, under normal operational parameters, would never have appeared in a pre-pacification assessment, scenarios involving decade-long insurgencies, sustained infrastructure disruption, and what the document referred to, in notably understated phrasing, as cultural regenerative capacity exceeding model parameters. The conclusion read, "Pacification is achievable. Timeline and resource cost are not within acceptable operational bounds." Shanveth read the conclusion twice. Then he called Kethra his recommending against, she said, before he could speak. "Yes. So are you." It was not a question. He didn't answer it as one. "I need to think about how to frame this for the Imperial Command," he said. "A recommendation against pacification on military cost grounds is unusual. A recommendation against pacification because the target population is," he paused, searching for the correct language, "because the target population presents an asymmetric endurance profile will require considerably more documentation." Kethra was quiet for a moment. "There's a second option," she said. "Tell me." The woman, Reyes, she said they had an alternative proposal. "They said we might find them more useful intact than in pieces." She pulled up the original transmission on the room display. "We've been so focused on the military modeling that we haven't asked what the alternative actually is." Shanveth looked at the frozen image of Anna Reyes on the display. He had been doing that, he realized it now, for most of the past 48 hours. Returning to her face. Trying to read something in it that he couldn't quite name. "I know what the alternative is," he said quietly. "I think I've known since I read the history." He stood. Let's go back. The second meeting had a different quality than the first. Something had shifted in the room, some threshold crossed during the 48 hours of silence between the sessions. The human delegation came back looking tired in the particular way of people who have not slept but have spent the sleepless hours doing something they considered necessary. Reyes had changed her jacket. The historian had not. He arrived wearing the same clothes he had worn 2 days prior, carrying a battered paper notebook, actual paper, Sharnveth noted with involuntary fascination, filled with handwritten notes. Day Saturday. There were no preliminary formalities this time. Sharnveth said, "Tell me about the alternative." Reyes looked at the physicist, who opened a second case and placed 3 data drives on the table. In the course of preparing our defensive analysis, she said, "We identified 17 points at which your fleet's operational capability, as we've been able to assess it from observation, intersects with problems we have been working on independently for some time." She gestured to the drives. Energy containment. Long-range materials fabrication. Navigational modeling in high-gravity gradient environments. We have partial solutions to several of these that our own scientists believe are, in some respects, non-standard. Non-standard, Sharnveth repeated. The physicist spoke for the first time since the opening session. He was a compact man, older than the historian, with the specific quality of distraction that Sharnveth associated, across species, with individuals who spent most of their conscious life operating at the edge of what was currently understood. When you've been working in isolation from the broader galactic community, the physicist said, you occasionally arrive at solutions from unexpected directions. Dead ends that turn out not to be dead ends. Approaches that a more connected civilization might not have pursued because the consensus said they weren't viable. He tapped one of the drives. We've had a great deal of time to pursue approaches that the consensus said weren't viable. Sharnveth looked at the drives for a long moment. You're proposing a knowledge exchange. We're proposing a partnership, Reyes said. Which is different. She leaned forward slightly. You integrate us, not as a subject world, not as a pacified population, but as a member civilization. We contribute what we know. You contribute what you know. We operate within your political framework with negotiated autonomy. And you get something you have never had in 400 years of conquest. Which is? She held his gaze. 8 billion people who chose to be here. The silence that followed was the longest of the entire proceeding. Sharnveth was aware of Kethra beside him, perfectly still. Aware of Vorseth at the far end of the table, who had come into this meeting as a skeptic and was now, visibly, doing the same arithmetic that Sharnveth himself had been doing for 2 days. Subject populations were manageable. Subject populations required garrison forces, suppression infrastructure, resource expenditure on control systems that produce nothing. Subject populations harbored, across time, the slow accumulation of resentment that eventually, always eventually, required additional pacification. Every world the Empire held required the ongoing cost of holding it. A civilization that had chosen integration was an entirely different variable. A civilization that had, furthermore, spent the better part of its history learning to endure, to adapt, to find solutions in dead ends and flowers in Bond streets, that was not a variable he had any existing model for. The 17 points of intersection, he said. Show me the most significant. The physicist opened the first drive. What came up on the shared display was a navigational model, a solution to a problem in high-gravity gradient traversal that Varric engineers had been working on, in one form or another, for 60 years. The Imperial solution involved an energy expenditure that made certain transit corridors operationally expensive enough to avoid. The human solution involved an approach that the physicist described, with visible pleasure, as going around the problem instead of through it. Sharnveth's tactical analyst leaned forward before he could stop himself. He stared at the model for nearly a full minute. Then Vorseth said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That's elegant." The physicist looked at him. Something in the look, recognition, perhaps, of one specific kind of mind by another, passed between them. We have 16 more, the physicist said. They talked for 9 hours. At the end of the 9th hour,